My name is Claire Bian. I'm president of ISPS-US and also on the board of directors of the Hearing Voices Network USA. I'm really delighted to be hosting this second collaborative webinar between ISPS-US and the HVN USA. And you'll be hearing very soon from Daniel Bergner, Caroline, and Bob Bergner. And I also wanted to introduce Jeannie Bass, who will be helping to field questions that are posted in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Please use chat only for comments and put all of your questions in the Q&A box. Before I turn the virtual microphone over to our panelists, I'd like to tell you a bit about ISPS-US. It is the US branch of the International Society for Psychological and Social Approaches to Psychosis, which promotes psychological and social approaches for working with people who hear voices or experience other unusual or extreme experiences. We do this work through educational programs and dialogues or trialogues with mental health professionals, people with lived experience, family members, and researchers. The organization was founded in Europe in the 1950s by a group of psychiatrists who were critical of the ways in which the array of experiences associated with psychosis, or a diagnosis on the schizophrenia spectrum, were being treated. ISPS's emphasis on psychological and social approaches to psychosis, and the focus on trauma as the principal root cause for the array of vulnerabilities that can lead people to hear voices when they're distressed, is significantly aligned with the Hearing Voices approach.
Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you to ISPS-US for helping to support HVN USA with this webinar. And I'm just so grateful for all the folks who are at 93 participants, all the folks that have come out to kind of delve deeper into this book, which I think is very unique in many ways, and how it weaves sort of the wisdom of lived experience with Daniel's adventures in the labs of neuroscientists and other adventures. So really excited to get into this conversation. Before we begin, just to briefly introduce myself, my name is Caroline Mazel-Carlton, and I serve on the HVN USA board with Claire and Jeannie. Our roles are meant to build access to HVN across the country and really refine and redefine what our values are through our charter and resources. I'm also part of the Wildflower Alliance, and in my roles, do a lot of different things, from direct support to people in long-term forensic psych units, to groups in community. Now, as director of training, the bulk of what I do is educational opportunities, and helping to sort of not just define what our values are in a progressive mental health movement, but also how do we hold them? Like, what does it actually look like? What do I say to someone who is struggling? I guess the last thing I'll say about me, which I think is probably the most important, is that I'm someone who hears voices. I see and most often hear, but also see and sense things that other people don't. That's a part of my life experience. It's one that I still have to this day. And as Daniel's book highlights, there's been some ups and downs in my life, a lot based on how people responded to me for these experiences or having emotional distress. So that's very much a part of my daily life. And so I wanted to include it in my intro because it's something I draw from in my work pretty much constantly. So that is me. Next, I'm going to hit it over to Daniel, the author of The Mind and the Moon. Daniel, what would you like to share about yourself before we jump into a conversation?
Thanks, Caroline. And first, a big thanks to Claire and to Jeannie and to all of you for being here, and just immeasurable gratitude to you, Caroline, and then to Bob, just because to embark on this with me, and the book is largely your two stories with some science and with a third person's story woven in. To embark on that was a huge gesture, and gesture is too small a word. It's a huge step of faith, and I'm still so appreciative and so moved by that. Just really briefly, I write for the New York Times Magazine. I write books. Those books are works that start with listening, just a kind of listening that goes beyond listening that's imagining my way, or trying to, knowing that I can't finally, but trying to imagine my way into another person's world and mind and emotions. And that's what I do.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Daniel. And yes, you are an incredible and deep listener, and I've always appreciated that about you. Pastor Bob, I'm so excited. This is our first time meeting. I loved reading your story. Before we start, anything that you want to share kind of about who you are?
Thanks, Carolyn. I'm happy to do that. Thanks to everyone, first of all, for inviting me to participate in this. If I hoped anything would come out of my collaboration with Dan on the book, it was conversations like this. So I'm so glad this sort of thing is taking place. I am the pastor of an Episcopal Church in Hamden, Connecticut, which is one town north of New Haven, where I live. I'm also a musician and a dancer. And for those of you who've read the book, you know this, but I'll say it. So in addition to my, what shall I say, unhelpful encounters with the traditional psychiatric profession in my youth, as an adult later, after working at Yale New Haven Hospital for a couple of years as a chaplain, I then found work elsewhere, but continued to work as a volunteer, a musician, and my principal interactions were at the psychiatric hospital at Yale, two separate units in two different locations, but both associated with the hospital, where I would sing songs and write songs with psychiatric patients, which was a wildly gratifying thing to do, except COVID happened and the confines of a closed psychiatric unit seemed less welcoming to me, or less healthful to me. So I've been doing other things of late, but I will get back to that kind of work soon. Wildly rewarding, both just in general, but also because of my own personal experience and being able to reach out to folks who are having challenges of those kinds. So thanks again for having me today.
Thanks so much, Bob. And yeah, that part of your story about how, despite all that you went through, side effects from psychiatric drugs, really tough encounters with the system, the fact that you're willing, after you kind of escaped, to go back in and to bring music into those environments, that is just huge. And maybe we'll have time later to talk more about that. And yeah, the healing power of music and movement and dance, and how, those of us who are diagnosed with what are called severe mental illnesses should not be left out of, those types of approaches, but really be invited in. Awesome. So welcome, everyone. I think the way that we're going to start, as Claire said, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. I'm going to ask have a few questions and reflections to kind of get us started as well. So I wanted to start first with you, Daniel. There's this part in the book, there's many parts in the book that really strike me, but one in particular takes place in 1983. And you're a young person in 1983, and your parents hand you a book. It reminds me a bit, your description of this book, Mood Swing by a Psychiatrist. It reminds me a bit of the books that I would find that my parents would hide them from me on top of the refrigerator, but I'd find them up there like Your Emotionally Disturbed Child and be like, it's about me. But anyway, so your parents hand you this book, Mood Swing. I guess the hope is that they're going to educate you about your brother. But from the very outset, it seems like you had a deep discomfort with some of the claims being made by the psychiatrist that wrote the book, including him sort of armchair diagnosing, I think it was Theodore Roosevelt, Ernest Hemingway, Abraham Lincoln. And I think you described that, you perceived that almost as an act of violence in a way. I'm wondering if you could say more about that and what it was like to 40 years later release a book that's essentially kind of like a counterpoint to this chemical imbalance theory that was being posited at that time.
Yeah, it's a great question. Just for those people out there for whom 1983 sounds like an entirely different era, we are living in that era in terms of psychiatry. That's when the sort of emphasis on the medical model really took hold. And yes, Bob was on a locked ward, and I have this book right here called Mood Swing, and our parents handed me this book, not just in the hope that they could educate me, but in the desperate need to have me agree with them and agree with the psychiatrists who were telling them, we've got this, just get this young man medicated and it'll be okay. But if you don't, it will really, really not be okay. He might well take his own life. So you can imagine as a parent, terrifying. You've completely lost control and you're being told to give over control to psychiatry and to medication. And yes, I started reading the book dutifully, but increasingly uneasily, because just as you say, early on in the book, the author, psychiatrist, retrospectively diagnoses President Roosevelt, President Lincoln, and Ernest Hemingway with severe psychiatric disorders, which, Lincoln ought to have been hospitalized and medicated, Hemingway, if only he'd been medicated, et cetera, et cetera. And there was such certainty about this so many years after the fact without the person there, and people who've done just amazing, still historically resonant, artistically resonant things. And it just felt, yes, as you say, just like an act of violence, an act of tremendous arrogance. And I felt discomfort, and I felt like maybe there's something wrong with me because I'm resisting what this scientist has put before us, and I'm resisting our parents' wishes. But that discomfort never really went away. And so I suppose you're right to analyze me and say I wrote this book as a kind of very long and I hope intimate and compelling response to that book. But yeah, I won't let myself get started, but I could easily feel what I felt then, and discomfort's probably an understatement.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Daniel, for saying that despite the fact the book was written in 1983, like 40 years ago, a lot of those claims are still kind of being made. Certainly, we're only one of two countries in the world where pharmaceutical, the US and New Zealand are the only countries where it's legal for pharmaceutical corporations to advertise direct to consumers. So we're still very much like swimming in that. I would love to come back and ask more about kind of like what the response has been like a year out, since you introduced a book that does challenge that dominant narrative.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being willing to share more about that book, Daniel. Bob, I had a question for you. This is a book about books sometimes, like in a way. And we talk a lot about stories in the Hearing Voices movement and how, stories rather than statistics or diagnoses are what we really connect with. There's a part in the book, Bob, where you are really going through it. And it seems like you're feeling quite isolated from other people, like that you might not have anything to offer. In fact, if you read the book, Bob, you literally have a t-shirt that you wear that says, "I feel like I have nothing to offer." But there's this moment where you are reading Franny and Zoe by J.D. Salinger. And to me, like in that vignette that Daniel writes, it's almost like you're encountering this book as like a sacred text in a way. And there's something at the end of this book that sort of gives you the message that maybe there can be deeper meaning in the world. Maybe it's possible to tap into things that people might find mundane and see deeper spiritual meaning in there. And so I'm just curious for you, like, what was the impact of that message on you, or what was the impact of that book, and what role did it play in like helping you survive like all the other shit that was about to come at you?
Another great question. First, I have to say about mood swing. So I'm not sure when the coin dropped, as it were, but I was given the book as well to read, to learn about myself, and had a similar reaction. And I remember saying to my wife, this must have been years later, because honestly, at least for me, having experienced the kind of things that I did, these experiences are never far from my mind. So I often review them, like, how did that happen? Why did they say that? How did that happen? So one of the things I said to my wife was, yeah, it's all well and good to diagnose Winston Churchill, who was one of the characters being diagnosed. But the problem is, if somebody said, well, I saved the world from fascism, you could say that's crazy, you're being grandiose, but actually it's true. So how can you use that as a component in your diagnosis if it actually happened and you actually did that crazy, grandiose thing? But back to your question about another book.
No, I'm glad you shared that, Bob, because I didn't know they'd also given it to you. That must have been.
Oh yeah, no, they were trying to tell me what I was really about. Absolutely. Yeah, Franny and Zoe. So it's not like if you asked me what like the most important book in the world was, I probably wouldn't put Franny and Zoe at the top of that list. But really, at that moment, and even in more specific ways, albeit what you said is true as well, just an opening into learning that other people experienced things, saw things that perhaps were broader, more ephemeral, more mystical than, is allowed in the common conversation. But really specific things about Franny's experience, and that she's obviously having a really hard time, and it has to do with college, and I was in college at the time, and that she's really at odds about what to do with herself and her life, and that she wants to be an actress, and that at the time I was being a theater student, also feeling like, why am I doing this? What's the importance of this? And then she has this conversation with her, and she's worried that, she's going to get stuck in these meaningless theater situations and I'll just use the word blue-haired ladies, and like, who cares about that? I want to be a Broadway star. But then she's speaking to her brother, and he says, yeah, this is unfortunate in the modern dialogue, but I'll say it because it's in the book. He tells her, he says to her, it's okay, the fat lady is Jesus. So all these people that she was thinking, if I get stuck playing for these people that I'm not really interested in, that seem really mundane to me, somehow I will have wasted my life. But that message was one of, everybody is in this spiritual thing together, and you never know who it is you're playing to. And even if it seems like, and now actually this probably plays into my willingness to go back on the psych wards and play music with people, like, look, these people in the psych ward need music as much as anybody does, and you're just as valuable a contributor to the wellness and well-being of the world going to psych ward to play music with 10 people as performing at Madison Square Garden. So it just allowed me to let all that go, even if just for a moment, like whatever path I was on, and whether I was going to play on Broadway or play down the street at whatever, it didn't matter. And it just freed me it did more than free me. It totally transformed me. In that moment, I just started crying and thought, wow, everything's going to be okay. It really was the most powerful bit of book I've ever read, probably outside of the Bible, as a pastor. Have to say that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, Daniel, did you have something you wanted to share? Go ahead.
One quick and then a question. I'm always humbled on a project like this, and one way I'm humbled is by what I didn't find out in time to include it. There are a couple things lately with you, Caroline, one of which I think maybe we'll touch on soon. And then I actually didn't know, I don't think, that our parents had given Bob the book. I surely would have written about that, but there are failures looming all around me, and that's just a good thing to be reminded of. I wanted to pick up on, Caroline, you used the word sacred. Bob, you just referred to a kind of, not a kind of, an actual religious experience, both on the page and then followed up in your life since. And I guess I just wanted to hear from both of you about the way the spiritual plays a role in your lives, because mostly, or partly, I want that just because in my world here in Brooklyn, my portion of Brooklyn, in my writer world, people tend to be very skeptical. That might be too kind a word, too gentle a word, very skeptical of the spiritual. And I feel like it's an underexplored part of ourselves. And I'd love to hear each of you talk about that a little.
Yeah.
So I'll call on you, Caroline, and then Bob, you go.
Yeah. Thank you for that question, Daniel. And yeah, I think for me, spiritual, there's been people that have been kind of allowed to define what spirituality is, sort of this like all sweetness and light and just like this like moment. And I think sometimes that's why people get skeptical about spiritual frameworks, is because people are suffering. Like they see someone suffering and in a lot of pain, and they think, what could be spiritual about this? It's sort of that positive vibes only form of spirituality. But for me, like one of the things that I have learned is that the trauma model and spirituality models, they're not a binary. It's not like there's one over here and then there's one over here. For me, like the events of my life are very sort of intertwined. And I can see like even some of my most difficult voices now, that they have a spiritual component. And it's almost like Bob described, like how Franny and Zoe gave him the freedom to see that, you know, the Messiah could be on the psych ward. Like, how do I know? In Jewish tradition, there's the idea that there's like, you know, these sacred people that exist, and they keep the world from being destroyed, but we don't know which ones they are, and they all have that potential. And I also learned that about some of my darkest voices. So initially, I was told my voices were like the symptom of a disease, that they were pretty meaningless. But now, you know, a big strategy I have is finding the deeper meaning in voices, certainly voices that say powerful things. Like I hear a voice sometimes that tells me, she'll be like, gather your fringes, Rivka. And what she means is she's referencing like a Jewish prayer shawl, but what she means is like bring people together, bring people on the fringes together. And that's really beautiful. And when I hear her voice, I feel warm and gooey inside. But there's other times when I've heard voices telling me to kill myself, or that voices that were crying or screaming and terrifying. And so for me, as an adult, you know, I'm starting to look at those voices as, you know, a sign for transformation. They might be prophetic voices in some way, like telling me, you know, something in my life needs to die so that I don't die. And I know we've talked about this before, Daniel, about speaking of the Bible. There's a story in the Bible about a guy named Abraham, and he's like, you know, like the father of like the Jewish people in some ways. But there's a point in the story where God's like telling him to kill his son, like kill your son. Or no, he doesn't say kill, he says sacrifice, right? And so he goes to like literally do it. And then God's like, whoa. No. Take your son off that altar. Here's a ram. Don't do that. And to me, it's kind of this message from a sacred text that says, you know, if you're hearing a voice that's telling you to kill yourself or someone else, it probably has like a deeper meaning and a deeper metaphor. So for me, honestly, like spirituality embeds probably like most of my experiences in some way, I believe are informed by spirituality. And I don't think this is in the book, but I know, Daniel, you know well about the voice I hear named Frank, who has a place in the book not a super warm and fuzzy voice. But currently, like, my understanding is that I think that he was someone that lived, and maybe he was me, and like we're connected to each other. So I guess I'm sharing a lot right now, and I think the heart of it is I want to make sure that we give voice hearers and neurodivergent people the right to be spiritual beings and be so, like, in a way that makes sense for them. I certainly I also love, models that focus on trauma, and I've had huge help from things like neurofeedback that are written about by trauma researchers and all of that. But I think, yeah, for me, and as I've turned 40, I've just gotten more honest about the fact that spirituality runs throughout my story and my experiences. And that's really, I have a right to define them in that way because that's what works for me.
Thanks, Caroline. I don't mean to take over the questioning role. Of course, it's the role I inhabit all the time, so it's almost reflexive. But Bob, will you say a little about spirituality in your life? And then I just want to make sure you touch on something that we've talked about, which is that at least once, maybe more often, when I've asked, when you think back to your early 20s and to being on that locked ward and then to another, I've asked, how would you talk about it? What term or terms would you use? And you've said at times, I think of it as a spiritual crisis. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
I can. So first of all, I'll echo Caroline's statement about, and now it's been too many seconds since I heard it, but about spirituality being interwoven and in many, most, if not all of her experiences in some way. So that's certainly how I feel. And after years of trying different, what shall I call them, spiritual practices, spiritual disciplines, and feel like I really settled into a meditative practice that, as I was just writing to a friend of mine, really stabilizes my emotions and clears my perception and allows me, maybe most importantly, to honor and own the sense that I have of interconnectedness with the universe, written as large as you want to write that word, and to really feel comfortable with that. In fact, I just expanded my practice. I used to just meditate once in the morning, and not really for a long time, but nevertheless every morning. And because of some things going on in my life otherwise, which we may or may not get to, decided to expand that to 3 times a day. So they're still short sessions, but it means that at any moment of the day, whether I'm feeling frustrated by something or feel like I didn't do something as well as I could have, or maybe that I'm delighted about something that happened, I'm never more than a few hours away from my next session of just sitting and breathing and allowing my mind to clear and perceiving again that connection, which at this point I find to be a very positive and supportive connection with everything that's around me. Yeah, so spiritual crisis, I guess I can only speak from my experience, but I understand that it's maybe a large part of other people's experience when they're going through what is called a psychological or psycho-emotional crisis. A large part of that there's a large spiritual component, in part because in our culture, we don't, as I think just got said, we don't really have a context for spiritual experience. Maybe Brooklyn, your part of Brooklyn is like the ultimate example of that somehow we've decided that spiritual experience is either not real or not an acceptable thing to bring into a conversation and to express as one's, if even one's most important experience, but certainly one's experience. And I think the Franny and Zoe example is a good one, that the undoing of whatever difficulty, although it just led to more difficulties subsequently, because I started talking about it to the wrong people, perhaps that's not the best word, just people who weren't able to understand it, that the undoing of whatever difficulty I was having had a very specific spiritual content to it, because ultimately the difficulty I was having was one of spiritual understanding, spiritual perception, and personal spiritual identity. Like, who am I that I'm having these experiences of perceiving, like, I guess I'll use the word voices, but I'm not sure it's exactly the same way Caroline would, but that somebody somewhere was trying to communicate to me, and that I was being called to do something, but I had no idea what. And there was no context within which to discuss that in the world around me. And then reading this book, obviously I wasn't the only person thinking about those kind of things, because here was this woman in the book who was totally transformed when her brother said, the fat lady is Jesus. And I just thought, wow, I'm not alone in this journey. So for me, that the living through of spiritual experience and learning how to accommodate them and welcome them and be with them in a helpful way is really the centerpiece of what I do. I guess that's why I'm a pastor. Although I will say, I don't find that many people willing to jump on the meditation bandwagon that I find so essential to my own well-being. I think it's just looked on as kind of an unusual outlier thing to do.
I love that you also, sorry, I was just going to say, I love that I try to do three times a day too, like sort of like a meditation check-in with like my inner world. Sometimes I'll communicate with my voices at that time. Sometimes I'll reach out to a kind voice, but yeah, I try to do 3 times a day. Also just because I base it on like, I've been informed a lot by rediscovering like Jewish practice. Like when I became Mazel-Tov Cocktail, the roller derby player, I also became a very visible Jew and like, but didn't really know a lot. And so I've been on this journey, and yeah, traditionally Jews, you would meditate or pray 3 times a day, right? Shacharit, Mincha, and Mariv. So yeah, that's really cool. I just had to like, yeah, give that a shout out. But Jeannie, yeah, you're seeing some questions popping up.
Yeah, we have a few questions. One pertains to spirituality. The person was asking, David was asking, when you say spiritual, are you referring to the soul or the physical body, or the life of the soul and the physical body?
So for me personally, I don't like to separate those things out as much. Like in Hebrew, like nefesh, it can mean soul and body. So right now, like I'm actually like trying to be more in my body and see my body as sacred too. I think a lot of sexual trauma survivors, or I also think some of my time on heavy neuroleptics was traumatic for my body. So I guess for me, spirituality is very broad, and it can include like embodied experiences as well as connecting with like different parts of us or nature or our ancestors. Like I use that word like incredibly broadly, and personally I know there might be differences, and Bob is the one who's gone to theology school, but like in a lot of cultures you wouldn't separate those out necessarily. But if it works for you to do that, great.
I'll let Bob take over in a sec. I just want to say I am surrounded by banners here in Brownstone, Brooklyn, that would seem to indicate there's a sharp line between them. Those are the banners which have some legitimacy behind them, which say science is real. My suspicion is always that the people flying those banners feel like spirituality in any form is kind of worse than not real, is a fool's errand, is a sign of weakness. And I wish they were out there in the audience today. Maybe a few of them will watch. That's just not so. These things, body, mind, science, spirituality, can be completely interwoven. And it bewilders me why that is so hard to see. It's almost as though the people who are discomforted or worse by spiritual talk are like clinging to something. And the clinging is, I think, always an indication that there's a fear at work rather than an insight.
Bob, what say you?
I say this is a tremendous conversation. Yeah, as far as separation between or distinguishing between spirituality that's sort of unembodied and embodied, I would agree with Caroline. Not that I'm not taking that on. Certainly as a dancer and a workout fanatic for whom keeping my body healthy is like another, besides meditation, like the centerpiece of my just overall sense of well-being. Yeah, the two are wildly intertwined. Interestingly, I don't want to go too far on this tangent, but I will mention that the same friend that I was exchanging emails with about meditation sent me an article about one of the church fathers' origin, in which he, who actually was then condemned as a heretic, in which he explained how spirit and soul and body were actually sort of different manifestations of the same elemental energy, might be a good word for it. So like that topic's right in the front of my mind. Also, so speaking of, as long as we're doing religion, nephesh being flesh or spirit or some intermingling of that, of course, in the Christian tradition, growing out of the Jewish tradition, the divine becomes flesh. So the divine couldn't become flesh if those two things are radically separate. No, they're intermingled, and that's really at the heart of the Christian story. So yes, I'm not distinguishing, and yeah, I'm not sure why the distrust of spirituality or spirit, actually, since it seems like it's simply another aspect of reality that indeed it's harder to put it into a scientific study, but nevertheless, so many millions of people experience it, if not billions. I'm not sure the point of pretending it doesn't happen or that it's not existent.
And I've totally noticed, and I'd love to hear more about your experiences in seminary, Bob. What I've noticed is there's this attitude that spirituality, even when people are accepting of it, that it's dangerous for people like us to, like for example, the first institution to ever posit that boys here suffer from a chemical imbalance was actually the Catholic Church, who said that, using the Hippocratic four humors, they said, oh, those people, they're not really hearing the voice of God. They just have too much black bile in their system, and we have to adjust their chemicals. And I feel like still to this day, I'll just share an experience I had that was literally yesterday. So literally yesterday, I went to a dance meditation course that was being taught by someone who had studied many years with Sufis. I love Sufis. Happy Ramadan to everyone who celebrates. And so I I was curious to learn from this person, and we learned different techniques. But I overheard like one of the participants saying why she had moved away from the Bay Area to where I live. She was like, yeah, I had to get away from all the crazy, psychotic, homeless people. But I found out they're still here. And I was like thinking, yeah, and they're in the room with you right now doing the world. But later, as the result of doing some of these practices that we were doing, like in the retreat, a woman had a vision. Like she had another woman had a pretty intense visionary experience during a dancing where she like went through a war zone, but at the end she found her grandparents that had died and they came to her and she shared these visions. But then at the end she was kind of like, or maybe I'm just psychotic. And what I found is that there's such a dominance right now with sort of the pharmaceutical model and the language of the DSM. I don't even call it the medical model anymore. I just won't. It's the pharmaceutical model to me. That there's such a dominance that it's actually sort of like, I don't know, killing some of the conversations about spirituality. And I guess one of the things I've been so curious about, Bob, and I've never gotten to hang out with you until this, is did you have to go through experiences in seminary where you heard people like essentially talking about you, but in a way that acted like you were somehow separate from like, sort of the divine project? Kind of like once I wasn't allowed to go to a Buddhist retreat center unless I screened first with the social worker. And it was like, why the F do I have to do that? Like the Buddha didn't come and say there's a path out of suffering, but not for those people. He just said there was a pathway out. But I'm curious, like, how did you find seminary? Did you have to listen to some of like those microaggressions? And like, what are your thoughts on how spiritual communities can do better?
Well, I have so much to say. I was trying to find a pencil so I could take notes. So I'll try to get through my list. So first of all, I don't know, Dan, if I ever told you this story, but back when I was having difficulty before Franny and Zoe, I had actually been involved with Hillel. So not to be confusing to any of our watchers, Dan and I both we're from a Jewish family. I since got baptized as a Christian as well. And I do use the word as well intentionally. Anyway, I was involved with Hillel, and then I stopped being involved with Hillel, and then I started having this hard time, and I went to the rabbi, and admittedly, he was probably a young guy at Hillel, so I'm not going to hold anything against him. But I told him how the difficulty I was having. I think he might have been a little annoyed that I'd stopped participating. And he said, and I said, I think it has something to do with my relationship with God, which is absolutely true. And he said, I think you should just go see a psychiatrist because, they have, I don't know what he said, medication or ways to help people like you now. So these are just going to be random stories, but they're all on a theme. Later, when I was training to be a chaplain at the hospital, I actually wanted to be assigned for my residency to the psychiatric hospital, but I was told that they don't allow chaplain residents to work at the psychiatric hospital because they want to be careful. This is now my interpretation, not to bring any spurious religious content to the patients. So 3, 4, 5, here we go. I'll try to get through my list. Seminary, a couple things. One is because where I went to seminary was kind of an old school, there was really no context within our seminary training to express our personal experience, which might seem odd, but it was true. So there was actually no place for me to either hear about people like me or to express my own experience and have people respond to me in potentially a negative or positive way. And then finally, as part of our training, we did do some more intense pastoral training. And it was at that point, or in related class actually, that only slightly tangential, we were supposed to make a genealogical tree for ourselves. And this might have been in the book, but certainly related to it was in the book. And I realized that as I started making this tree, that I had to keep blacking out people on my mother's side of the family in large numbers because they'd all been killed in the Holocaust. And this really hit me heavily because it's the first time I'd really taken stock of the carnage that had been left in my family, just one generation away. And so I went to speak with the pastoral care teacher. And as we talked, I decided I had to confide in him because I had never told anybody this. The whole conversation about my experience with psychiatry I just closed the door on telling anybody about it because I just didn't want to even have the conversation and see I didn't want to know what people's response was. But I felt like I had to tell him because I needed to know, is this the kind of thing I need to tell my so-called church superiors before getting ordained? And he was so great. He said, you know what, Bob, just let it go. Don't even mention it. So kind of the opposite of what you were concerned about, Caroline, that he was he could see what would possibly happen, and he advised me to just don't even mention it. Subsequently, though, recently, because Dan's book came out, I felt like I had to tell people who might read it and not have them just be blindsided by it. So I've sent the electronic version to my bishops and said, this book's coming out. Let me know if you want to talk about it. And they similarly were just like, don't even think about it. Don't even worry about it. You're good. So actually, for the most part, really supportive from the church community.
But wait, Bob, can I ask a question? Is don't even think about it, just let it go. Is that good enough, or is that, I get that it is a blessing in a way, and effectively for your work, it is certainly a blessing, but did you hope for more than that at some level?
Well, from the first encounter, I'll go into a little more detail that I think will explain. So in the first encounter, don't even think about it, was exactly the response I wanted to hear. Thank you. I'm going to just move on because I can't let this interrupt the course of my vocation. In the second case, I'm being too dismissive, really. Actually, one of the bishops who just retired, after he retired, started engaging me in conversation. We actually had a long conversation about his own family's experience with mental illness. And he's read your book. And so actually, there's much more to it than just let it go. And that's great. I could have gone either way, but I'm delighted, as with these conversations, I'm delighted that, as I said, that's one of the reasons I agreed to tell the story, that it might be of importance to somebody else and that the conversation would continue.
We had a couple questions come in that I think might be helpful. One was asked quite a while ago, was what kind of advice, what kind of thoughts do you have to put out to another or to a family member that might be supporting a voice here? And on that same tone, I'd like to throw in my own question, which might be for Caroline, might also be for Bob, but if there's voice hearers that are here right now, and maybe this is their first time hearing people that have had their own experiences, what do you want to leave them with? So that's it.
I mean, the number one thing that I would want to leave voice hearers with is that you are an amazing person that is worthy of dignity. The content of your voices, you know, it says nothing about who you are. You know, it says a lot about, you know, what you've been through and the society in which we live. As Americans, we tend to hear vastly more violent voices than people in other countries. I think for me, like, the reason why I love this book is I think it's a sacred text about humility in my view, and that's just my opinion. And if systems had more humility, then we would have less voice hearers walking around with the incredible weight of shame that I still very much carry. I carry shame in my body, in my thoughts, and my feelings. I feel it. And most of the people I support these days are under an incredible weight of shame and institutional trauma. And I know that people are popping off in the chat in various ways right now, talking about negative voices and this, that, and the other. What I would just say is be careful about not adding more shame to the burden that voice hearers and experiencers already bear. I think that the more we define voices as these negative, scary, or dangerous things, that can backfire, and that can backfire right into the faces of like the people who hear them. So I think as family, like, I mean, this is a book that's about, you know, like not freaking out. Like, I don't think Bob and I had the benefit of family members that could really, I'll just speak for myself. Like, my parents, you know, are still very bought into like the medical model. And I think it's nice if, you know, if there are family members here that can think about like alternatives and really listen to your child. Because yeah, I think what it comes down to, a lot of us are, I'll just say it again, it's the shame that is deadly, I think. You know, sometimes, like, you know, we get all these emails, like, especially since Daniel's article and book came out, we get tons of email, and I respond to ones that I can. And sometimes I can only talk to the person, the experiencer, for like 20 minutes. But often at the end of the call, they'll say, "You saved my life, you changed my life." And all I've really done is I've told the person, there's nothing wrong with you. These things are really, really hard, but other people deal with them, and there's ways to deal with them. And there is not a damn thing wrong with you. You have survived so much. And like, people, they just, yeah, they blossom, even in like a phone call where it's like they are told that. So I think like we're talking about some really universal principles here that, yeah, that some of us at Passover Seder this week, or at Easter this week, or at Iftar this week, we're going to be talking about some of these same principles of, you know, liberating ourselves from these oppressive systems that we internalize, loving other people, like, full stop. So that's what I'd like to say. Like, let's not compartmentalize these issues and hyper-medicalize what are deeply human issues, because, yeah, we don't want people to have to kind of carry that shame that, oh, you're dangerous, or there's something wrong with you. For me, like, yeah, like I hear voices, some of them scare me at times, and I need to know that like I'm loved by people so that I can make the right choices for me. So that's kind of like where I'm at with that. I also forgot what the exact question was. So maybe, I don't know, Bob, do you remember it?
I think it was just what would you offer to people who are hearing voices?
Yeah.
Sort of positive counsel.
And family members. Someone was wondering what you would share, to other family members.
Bob, do you want to go? And then I have a couple of things I want to add.
Yeah, to family members, I guess that's what's an important part of that. Well, I think Caroline's sort of off the cuff comment not to freak out might be the first thing, and to offer an attentive listening ear to the person and assure them, as Caroline's suggesting, of your love for them. From my experience, what I was going through and the actions I was taking that most freaked my parents out, actually, to me, and I think even 30, 40, almost 40 years later, still actually makes sense to me. Like, it wasn't just random stuff, although it might have seemed random and unusual to somebody looking on. In my own version of my narrative, it actually kind of made a lot of sense. And so and I noticed as I read the hospital records that I went back and got at some point, nobody took the time to actually try to understand what I was saying or why I was doing what I was doing. And so, yeah, it just seemed kind of weird and absurd. But to me at the time, and even looking back, it actually makes quite a lot of sense. So to really don't freak out, show some love, and really take the time to listen to somebody and honor that their experience might actually be deeply embedded in whatever they're going through is deeply embedded in their experience, and that it's not superfluous or tangential or just weird, that it's really part of who they are and what they experience on a regular basis.
Yeah, Caroline, I'll just quote you back to you. I often say to family members, when you're controlling, you're not connecting. Controlling is what we want to do as family members, terrified as a parent, but controlling almost inherently is not going to work because it just precludes communication and sharing and listening and lifting shame rather than imposing it, and diminishing isolation rather than widening it. That's what's ameliorative. And the distance is what can be, or part of what can be, the distance and the dismissal is part of what can be so destructive. At the risk of sounding overly upbeat, and I don't think my book is overly upbeat, although I do think it's affirming, and at the risk of sort of diminishing suffering, and Caroline, you've been very eloquent in keeping that word present in our conversations. I guess I wanted to touch on one amazing thing about each of you. So, Bob, if it's okay, I'm going to quickly summarize the Dinner for $1 program that you have going from your church, which is a food truck, and it offers dinner for $1. Why $1? It's not that if you absolutely cannot afford $1, you'll be forced to pay or you won't eat. That's not so. But it is a gesture to the public that says, come join in this public communal meals. So Bob spent some time homeless and lining up to eat in a church basement, and all the isolation that comes with that. And here is this program that runs entirely counter to that. That brings together people who can't afford and people who can afford, and attempts to have them join in eating together. Just as your work on the psychiatric wards with music is so profound, I find that so profound. And I guess in answer to the question about family or people who are really dealing with intensely negative, and I'll put that in quotes, voices, here's a large way to turn that experience when you're in your 20s into something really profound and positive now. And I just think even if we all don't have access to food trucks and to churches to mobilize our efforts in this way, that service is one way out. Reaching out is one way out. And then, Caroline, I was just hoping you would talk about something. This was one of those humbling things. So you told me, I may get it wrong, long ago about receiving a call from a single mother during COVID, who was hearing voices saying either she cuts off her child's hand, or cuts off her own hand.
Yeah, it was her own hand.
Right, cuts off her own hand, or the voice will kill her child. Now, when we first talked, I think I must have been so overwhelmed by that I really didn't ask a follow-up question, the obvious follow-up question, which I'm kind of still wince at my failure. And then much later, when we were going over things for the magazine version of this, I did ask you, and you had this moment with that caller that signified to me how your own experience, as difficult as it has sometimes been, and as it can still sometimes be, enabled you to have a depth of insight that so few of us would have had, certainly not on the spot. And I use that word insight very pointedly, because of course what's often said to dismiss people as, oh, they don't have insight into their own condition. You brought such depth of insight, and I'm wondering if you can just touch on that moment and what you sort of slowly led that mother to see.
Well, we had a conversation, and a lot of the conversation was about sort of the pressures of motherhood, especially in the pandemic, and how, currently, it does feel like you're supposed to sacrifice entire parts of you, like almost to keep your child alive. You have to somehow work to provide, but you also have to make sure they do their Zoom school, and you're exhausted and all these pieces. So any conversation that I have with someone, we're human, we have to have like just awe about the complexity of how our minds can make sense of things. So I think what was really needed was just a conversation about the pressure, and that it's so real, and she's not alone in feeling like parenthood is a sacrifice of like immense proportions, especially now, and how you get more support as a parent. But we also talked about ways to harm reduction approaches with the voice. So could you draw a picture, trace your hand and burn it in a fire, and offering I'm giving up this part of myself. So I know there's a big conversation in the chat right now. And I just want to shout out to Erin Nichols, who I think is offering essentially saying a lot of the same things I'm saying right now, which are sort of looking for that meaning. But we can also, engage with, in Hebrew, we call it the pashat, the literal meaning of the text. We can also engage with that too. So it's like, if I'm hearing a voice telling me to throw myself out of this office window, there's a couple different things I can do. Like, I can think about, can I lower the stress in this moment? And maybe that voice will respond, or can I take a break from work? Or I could go down to the stoop and throw myself off the stoop, and, you know, kind of like, you know, get some relief that way. So I think certainly we fail people when we say this is meaningless manifestations of a chemical imbalance. But we want to honor like the complexity of these phenomena, and allow people to have, I think dignity is a common thread here. You know, the dignity of exploring the experience on these levels, because they are a complex being that is suffering and has been through a lot. And the hope is, you know, I lead trainings on how to support people, and certainly we have clinicians come too. And the last one I did, I don't know if Andrew Lieberman is still in the room from France, but Andrew, you came and you're like, you know, this is a lot like, you know, what I'm learning in Zurich in psychoanalysis, right? Oh, hi, Andrew. And a lot of times people find, hey, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir with ISPS. You know, there are these certain approaches that ask us to take those deep dives with the person in a compassionate way. And in the discipline I practice, which is peer support, inspired by intentional peer support, and my sensei, Sherry Mead, we practice these disciplines and also try to eliminate power differentials as well. So that's one of the reasons why I haven't like pursued like licensure or like a super formal degree, is I just want to make sure, like, you know, someone can talk to someone more of like an equal footing, because sometimes that can bring up fear or shame. But yeah, thank you for asking me about that, Daniel. And I'd love to hear from you, Daniel, if you want to share. I feel like Bob and I have shared some of like what we've dealt with, like sort of with being out. But I never got a chance to ask you, like, what it's been like for you in this past year, where, you know, you've written books that are beautifully written on a whole range of topics, you know, from the rodeo to opera to like prisons, but this is your first time delving into this highly charged world. And I'm just curious, like, what has that been like for you? Is there anything you've learned since the book and article came out, and from like the responses that you received, like any recommendations you have?
That's a big question.
I know.
You know, it's been in some ways a really gratifying experience, and occasionally I'd say a difficult experience. So the difficult first, there are times when I feel like the book is on a marginal edge. To be candid, I do feel that sometimes. Like, people appreciate the writing and the storytelling, but are far from ready to go there. Far, far, far. On the other hand, I've had, and maybe increasingly am having, invitations to talk to groups that I wouldn't have expected. And, you know, of course, there's one of those invitations that I've spoken to both you and Bob about, and I hope will come to fruition, where we'll really get to address an audience of sort of influential psychiatrists who I might not have expected to be receptive. So, you know, I try to stay a little bit optimistic. I don't know how much more to say than that, but I do feel like there's a glimmer. I do feel like if we're a little bit lucky, the convergence of the beginnings of a willingness to talk about the spiritual, which takes us into some subjective or unshared, non-consensus realms, the beginning of a conversation about the importance of placing with oneself within something far larger, which, you know, in the few pages of the book where I get very personal, they're partly about that the convergence of that with maybe the beginning of a conversation that wonders about the practice of a default psychiatry that looks immediately at medication and instead of that begins to have some doubts and raise some questions, that maybe there's some reason for optimism.
And just to follow up to that, Daniel, like, are there, when you've spoken to people, like, I'm curious if there's any parts of the book that they name as being particularly impactful to them. You know, I think a lot of us are advocates and we're trying to figure out what will motivate social change. Like what? Like, is it science? Is it statistics? Is it stories? And I'm just curious if you could share with us, was there anyone who really changed their worldview based on reading the book, and did they tell you why?
That would be hard to sort out. So I think there's, you know, that's why I interweave, you know, your story, Caroline, Bob's story, David's story with the science. It's the interweaving that, if the book's going to have an effect, I think that's why. It's interesting. I won't name names, but there's one very, very, very prominent scientist, neuroscientist, who wrote to me and said, you know, I had tears in my eyes. Like this, you've managed somehow to tell the truth. Now that sounds very self-serving on this author's part, and I don't want to sound that way, but that was very gratifying and very hopeful. I would say on the science side, there's just one thing that no one argues against, and that is that our attempts at medication have stalled. We've made no substantial progress in at least 50 years, and you could argue 70. Not a single scientist has written to me and said, you got that wrong. So that's a staggering fact. And if we can sort of start, that fact gets people's attention no matter where I am. And then it's a matter of introducing the stories that begin to lead us to, one, ask the question, where can we go from here? And two, maybe the people I'm writing about have something to say about a new direction.
Thank you so much, Daniel. All right, we're kind of coming towards the end of our time. I know someone has asked like a question in the chat, which is a big one to unpack in just 7 minutes. Is it better to agree that someone is hearing God's voice if their God voice is mean? How would you suggest we respond? And so what I'll offer in very brief response to that is nothing shut a conversation down more quickly that if someone names their experience to me and I just say, no, that's not happening. I'm hearing the voice of God. No, you're not. Sorry, God doesn't talk to people. Like, I hope that, as Daniel said, we want to continue the connection with people. And so this is a very, I know nothing about the details of this scenario, but telling someone that you don't believe them and their experience isn't real or it's not meaningful, usually does not work well. I certainly talk to a lot of people who hear God's voice. And so really validating sort of the immensity of that, like, wow, that's got to be a lot to be hearing from God. How does it feel? Like, does it feel like that's a lot of pressure? How do you feel about what God is saying to you? Have you ever spoken with God before? I also like to ask people that are hearing a voice, like, what's been going on in your life recently? Because often voices are responding to events in the wider world. So getting some of that context about how it feels, has this happened? And we can really ask the person what they need right now. And I'll just say quickly, for me, I've had very intense spiritual experiences before where I didn't understand what they meant. And I've actually found comfort talking to other people and also reading about mystics from various traditions, like Teresa of Avila or St. John of the Cross, who also, incidentally, they're of Jewish heritage, but they're Christian because they lived in Spain at a time where there were conversions, but they are Jewish people ethnically. And so some of these models of how people have dealt with really intense experiences. But yeah, what I would start with is just building connection by asking the person more about the experience, maybe sharing some of your own experience about how you've dealt with, getting a conflicting message from an authority figure and what you did with that. Maybe you haven't heard from God's self, but perhaps someone has in an authoritative way told you something and you had to figure out, what do I do with this? And that can really build connection too. But yeah, if you want to learn more about how to use the hearing voices approach, what I will say is you can sign up for HVN's website, you can sign up for the Wildflower Alliance website, and you can donate more to HVN-USA so that we can provide more workshops and free opportunities to learn.
There was a really good comment, not a question, but a comment on Daniel's book. I just wanted to read really quickly, maybe a good way to end. And I just want to put a plug in. I know we talk a lot about the book, but I've read both the physical book, but the Audible is excellent. It's probably the best Audible. I'm not just saying it, probably the best audiobook I've ever listened to. Soothing, especially with the really dark historical stuff, for me, it's dark at least. I do put a plug in for that. But let me just give a quick read to this comment. There was a story that it's from Len. There was a story that Daniel told in the book about a situation where someone was about to be restrained on a psych unit, where a staff person says that if the person does not stop acting out, they will give him enough medication to turn him into a zombie. To anyone who has experienced being on neuroleptics, that is often part of how one feels when taking these medications. That was a very impactful story. So I just wanted to share that. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeannie. And thank you, Daniel and Bob, for coming out in support of HVN USA. Bob, thank you so much for telling your story. I was so grateful to hear it. And Daniel, what an incredible way that you have woven together, story, science, and spirit too, and these themes of humility and awe, and what a gift. I know maybe the book is a bit ahead of its time in many ways, and so it can't be easy, but what a true act of love that you've given us in this book, and so grateful.
Well, you, again, just immeasurable thanks to you and Bob. Real love to you both. It's so great even just to see you both on the screen. I could get really sentimental, but there's really no way to express how profound your effect has been on me, and whatever's good there on the page is due to that influence from both of you, and thanks to everybody out there.